She was 8 months pregnant when her husband's mistress punched her in the stomach. And her husband? He stood in the doorway and laughed. Sarah Miller thought that was the worst moment of her life. She was wrong, because 3 weeks later, she would be sitting in a jail cell, accused of murder, while the real killer walked free. But here's what Marcus Miller did not expect. He did not expect the woman he had spent 4 years breaking to become the one who would destroy him. He did not expect her estranged father to walk through that hospital door. And he definitely did not expect the mistress he tried to frame for murder to team up with the wife he tried to bury. This is not a story about a woman being saved. This is a story about a woman who saved herself. What you are about to hear will make you angry. It will make you cry. And it will make you believe that justice, real justice, is still possible when ordinary people refuse to give up. Sarah had no money, no lawyer, no powerful connections. What she had was the truth, a father who taught her to fight, and a group of mechanics and nurses and everyday heroes who showed up when it mattered most. Marcus Miller thought he was untouchable. He thought his family's money and his charm and his lies would protect him forever. He was wrong. Value statement. This story is for every woman who has ever felt trapped and wondered if escape was possible. It is for every person who has watched someone they love suffer in silence. And it is for everyone who needs to remember that the truth is patient. It waits. And when you hold on to it long enough, it becomes the weapon that sets you free. Meaning of the story. The meaning of Sarah's journey is simple but powerful. You do not need money to fight back. You do not need connections. You do not need to be special or brave or stronger than everyone else. You just need to document, to prepare, to find one person who believes you, and to never stop fighting, even when the whole world tells you to give up. Because the woman who survives, she is already inside you. She is closer than you think. And she is worth every moment of struggle it takes to become her. The fluorescent lights of Memorial General Hospital hummed with that particular frequency that makes everything feel slightly unreal. Sarah Miller sat alone on the examination table, her swollen belly stretching the thin fabric of her hospital gown. 8 months pregnant, exhausted, terrified in ways she could not name. She placed both hands on her stomach and whispered to her daughter, "Just a few more weeks, baby girl. Just you and me. We're going to figure this out. I promise." The ultrasound technician had stepped out to grab a doctor for a second opinion on something she had seen on the screen. She had smiled and said it was probably nothing. But Sarah had learned to read faces. That smile was the kind people wore when they did not want you to panic. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the meditation app had taught her before Marcus canceled her phone plan. The door exploded inward. Sarah's eyes flew open as the handle slammed against the wall, with a crack that echoed through the small room. A woman stormed inside, blonde highlights catching the harsh hospital light, designer handbag swinging from her elbow, perfume arriving before her words did. Crystal Vance. Behind her, leaning against the doorframe, with his arms crossed and a smirk stretching across his face, stood Marcus Miller, Sarah's husband, the father of her unborn child, the man who had promised to love and protect her. He was smiling. Crystal crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her heels clicking against the linoleum like a countdown. She grabbed Sarah's wrist, hard enough to leave marks. "I told you to disappear," Crystal hissed. Her breath was hot against Sarah's face, smelling of coffee and menthol cigarettes. "But you just do not listen, do you?" Sarah tried to pull away, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Please, I am pregnant. Crystal, please, you do not have to do this. Oh, I know you are pregnant. Crystal's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile on a different face. That is exactly why this is going to feel so good. Sarah saw the fist coming, but could not move fast enough. 8 months pregnant, trapped on an examination table, wrist locked in another woman's grip. The punch connected with her stomach, a solid blow that sent shockwaves of pain radiating through her entire body. She screamed. The baby kicked violently, a desperate fluttering that felt like panic translated into movement. Sarah crumpled forward, sliding off the table, her knees hitting the cold floor as she wrapped her arms around her belly, and Marcus laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable chuckle. It was genuine amusement, cold and sharp. The sound of a man watching something entertaining happen to someone he considered beneath him. Sarah looked up at him through tears, searching for any trace of the man she had married 4 years ago. The man who had brought her flowers on their 3rd date. The man who had cried at their wedding. The man who had held her hand when she first showed him the positive pregnancy test. That man was gone. Maybe he had never existed at all. Security! Someone shouted from the hallway. We need security in room 417. Footsteps thundered toward them. Crystal straightened her blouse, flipping her hair back with practiced nonchalance. Sarah slipped, she announced to no one in particular. Very dramatic. You know how pregnant women are. Marcus pushed off from the doorframe, still smiling. We should probably go, babe. Let the professionals handle this. But before they could take a single step, a figure appeared in the doorway. He was not tall, but he filled the space completely. Gray hair cropped short, weathered face lined with years of hard work, hands that had spent decades gripping wrenches and changing oil, now curled into fists at his sides. His eyes locked onto Marcus with a recognition that went beyond simple identification. This was the look of a man cataloging threats and calculating responses. Get your hands off my daughter. Marcus's smile died instantly. His face went pale, then red, cycling through emotions too fast to track. What the hell? Who are you? The man stepped into the room, and something about his presence made Crystal back away instinctively. Security guards appeared behind him, but they hesitated, reading the situation. Sarah stared up at him from the floor, pain and confusion mixing with something she had not felt in years. Recognition, disbelief, anger. Dad? Frank Miller looked down at his daughter, and for just a moment, his hard expression cracked. 10 years of distance, 10 years of silence, 10 years of guilt and grief and all the things that had driven them apart. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, his little girl was on a hospital floor, 8 months pregnant, clutching her stomach while her husband laughed. You, Frank said, pointing at Marcus without looking away from Sarah. Do not move, Marcus sputtered. You cannot tell me what to do. Do you know who my family is? Do you know who I am? Frank finally turned to face him fully. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I know exactly who you are, Frank said quietly. I have known men like you my whole life. You think money and a nice suit make you untouchable. You think nobody sees what you really are. He stepped closer to Marcus, close enough that Marcus had to lean back. But I see you, and I'm going to make sure everyone else sees you too. Security finally moved, 2 officers stepping between the men, while a nurse rushed to Sarah's side. Crystal was already backing toward the door, her bravado evaporating. Sir, one of the officers said to Frank, we need everyone to calm down. Frank held up his hands slowly, never breaking eye contact with Marcus. I am calm. I am the calmest I have been in 10 years. But that woman, he pointed at Crystal, just assaulted my pregnant daughter, and that man watched and laughed. So you might want to start asking them some questions. The officer looked at Sarah on the floor, at the red marks forming on her wrist, at the security camera blinking in the corner of the room. He reached for his radio. "This is Unit 7. I need a supervisor in room 417, and someone call the police." 6 months earlier, Sarah Miller had still believed her marriage could be saved. She stood in the kitchen of their apartment, the one Marcus had insisted they needed, even though the rent ate up most of her salary, holding a crumpled hotel receipt she had found in his jacket pocket. The Westbrook Inn, room 214, champagne service, one night stay. Her hands shook as she smoothed out the paper, reading the words over and over, as if they might rearrange themselves into something innocent. A business meeting, a misunderstanding, anything other than what they so obviously were. Marcus walked in from the bedroom, still adjusting his tie for work. When he saw her face, something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, assessment, then concern, perfectly performed. "Babe, what is wrong? You look upset." Sarah held up the receipt. "What is this?" He crossed the room and took it from her, studying it with furrowed brows as if he had never seen it before. "This? I have no idea. Probably fell out of a coworker's pocket when I borrowed his jacket last week." "Why, what did you think it was?" The explanation came so smoothly, so easily, like water flowing downhill, finding the path of least resistance. "I thought," Sarah started, then stopped. She felt suddenly foolish, paranoid, exactly the way he always made her feel when she questioned anything. Marcus pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her in a gesture that should have felt comforting, but instead felt like a trap slowly closing. "Sarah," he murmured into her hair, "we have talked about this. Your anxiety is getting out of control. This is why I keep saying you should see someone. A therapist, maybe. Get some medication." "I am not anxious," she said, but her voice came out small, uncertain. "You are checking my pockets now." He pulled back to look at her, his expression shifting to wounded disappointment. "Do you know how that makes me feel? Like you do not trust me. Like you are waiting for me to fail. I trust you." The words came automatically, a reflex built from years of having this same conversation. "I just saw it, and I wondered. You wondered if I was cheating on you." He shook his head slowly, the picture of a patient man pushed to his limit. "After everything I do for this family, after all the hours I work to keep us afloat, this is the thanks I get." Sarah felt the familiar shame washing over her. The receipt was probably nothing. She was probably overreacting. She always overreacted, did she not? That is what Marcus told her anyway. "I am sorry," she heard herself say. "I should not have jumped to conclusions." Marcus kissed her forehead, his lips cool and dry. "We will get through this, babe. But you really need to work on your insecurity. It is not healthy for the relationship." He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. "And maybe ease up on the spending, okay? I saw the credit card statement. $40 at Target last week. We need to budget better." The door closed behind him. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, still holding nothing, wondering when she had become the kind of woman who apologized for her own instincts. But here's the thing about Sarah Miller that Marcus never understood. She was not stupid. She was not weak. She was trapped, which is an entirely different thing. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, Sarah crept out of bed and into the bathroom. She locked the door, turned on the fan to cover any sound, and pulled out her phone. She opened the voice memo app. "September 14th, she whispered, 2:37 a.m. "I found a hotel receipt in Marcus's jacket today, the Westbrook Inn. When I asked about it, he told me I was being anxious and paranoid. He suggested I need medication." She paused, listening for any sound from the bedroom. "I do not think I am paranoid. I think something is wrong. I am going to start keeping records just in case." photographs, receipts, anything that seems off. She saved the recording and emailed it to an address she had created that morning. An address Marcus did not know about. An address that existed only for this purpose. If you are in a situation like mine and you are listening to this story, here is what I learned. Document everything. Write down dates and times. Take pictures of bruises, of receipts, of text messages. Email them to yourself at an address your partner does not know about. You might never need any of it, but if you do, you will be glad you have it. Over the next 6 months, Sarah built her case, piece by piece. A photograph of the bruise on her arm, where Marcus grabbed her too hard during an argument. A screenshot of a text message where he called her worthless. A record of every time he took money from their joint account without telling her. She was not ready to leave, not yet. The baby was coming, and she still clung to the hope that fatherhood might change him, that the man she fell in love with was still in there somewhere. But just in case he was not, she was preparing. She just did not know that Marcus was preparing too. The weeks after Sarah discovered the hotel receipt passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and quiet desperation. The baby grew. The distance between her and Marcus grew faster. And then she met Diana Cole. Diana was a nurse at Memorial General, assigned to Sarah's prenatal care team. She was 35, a single mother of a 7-year-old boy named Jaden, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Sarah found instantly comforting. "You doing okay, honey?" Diana asked during one of Sarah's checkups. "And I do not mean physically. I mean up here." She tapped her temple. Sarah hesitated. She had become so used to pretending that the truth felt foreign on her tongue. "I am fine," she said automatically. Diana set down her clipboard and looked at Sarah with an expression that said she had heard that particular lie 1,000 times before. "My ex used to make me say that too," Diana said quietly. "Fine. Everything is fine. I am fine. It took me 3 years to stop being fine and start being honest." Sarah's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. That was the beginning. Diana became the first real friend Sarah had made since marrying Marcus. They started meeting for coffee, then for lunch, then for long conversations in Diana's car, in the hospital parking lot where no one could overhear them. Diana listened without judgment as Sarah slowly unraveled the story of her marriage. The financial control, the emotional manipulation, the growing isolation from everyone she had once known. And Diana offered something Sarah had almost forgotten existed: practical help. "My cousin Patricia is a family lawyer," Diana said one afternoon. "She does payment plans for women in situations like yours. She has seen cases like Marcus before." Sarah shook her head. "I cannot afford a lawyer. Marcus controls everything." "That is why Patricia does payment plans," Diana repeated patiently. "And you have been working as a paralegal for 3 years. You know the system better than most people walking into family court. You are not as helpless as he wants you to believe." For the first time in months, Sarah felt something spark in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope, which was almost as good. She started making plans. First, the money. Every time she bought groceries, she got cash back. $5 here, $10 there. She hid it in her pregnancy journal, knowing Marcus would never touch something so sentimental. Second, the documentation. Her secret email account now contained dozens of recordings, photographs, and written accounts of Marcus's behavior. Timestamps and dates, evidence that could not be explained away. Third, the escape route. Diana offered to let Sarah stay in her spare room temporarily. "Just until you get on your feet," Diana said. Jaden would love having a baby around. By her 7th month of pregnancy, Sarah had $847 hidden away, a folder full of evidence, and a plan to leave Marcus the week after the baby was born. She met with Patricia Wells on a Tuesday afternoon, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and excitement. Patricia's office was small but professional, decorated with diplomas and photographs of grateful clients. Sarah sat across from her, hands folded over her belly, and laid out everything: the financial abuse, the emotional manipulation, the isolation, the evidence she had collected. Patricia listened carefully, taking notes, nodding in all the right places. When Sarah finished, Patricia set down her pen. "You have done incredible work," Patricia said. "This level of documentation is unusual. Most women in your situation do not have nearly this much." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Does that mean you can help me?" Patricia's expression shifted. Something uncomfortable flickered across her face. "I want to help you," she said slowly. "I really do. But I am afraid I cannot take your case." Sarah's smile faded. "What? Why not?" Patricia sighed heavily. The Miller family, Marcus's parents, own the dealership chain on the east side of town. They have been clients of this firm for 15 years. It is a conflict of interest. "So recommend someone else," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Another lawyer in the county." Patricia looked down at her desk. "That is the problem. There are only 4 family law practices in this county. 3 of them have existing relationships with the Miller family. The 4th," she hesitated. "The 4th what?" "The 4th requires a $5,000 retainer up front. No payment plans." She met Sarah's eyes with genuine sympathy. "I am so sorry. The Miller family has been here a long time. They have connections everywhere." Sarah sat frozen in her chair as the weight of Patricia's words settled over her. She had done everything right. She had documented. She had planned. She had found a friend and a place to stay, and $847 that represented months of careful, terrifying work. And it still was not enough, because Marcus's family did not just have money. They had power. The kind of quiet, insidious power that seeped into every corner of a small community until there was nowhere left to hide. That night, Marcus was waiting when Sarah got home. He was sitting in the dark living room, a single lamp casting shadows across his face palm. His phone glowed in his hand. "Heard you went to see Patricia Wells today," he said conversationally. "Funny thing, her secretary plays tennis with my mother." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus stood up slowly, pocketing his phone. His smile was back, but it looked different now. Sharper, more honest. "You think you can lawyer up against my family in this town?" He walked toward her, each step deliberate. "Sweetheart, you cannot even afford diapers without me." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "Give me your car keys." "Marcus, now." Her hand shook as she pulled the keys from her purse and placed them in his palm. "You will not be needing these anymore," he said. "And Sarah, do not embarrass yourself like this again. I always find out." He walked past her, toward the bedroom, whistling softly. Sarah stood alone in the dark living room, one hand pressed against her stomach, where her daughter kicked restlessly, and felt hope die inside her chest. 3 weeks after Marcus took her car keys, Sarah found herself in an ultrasound room at Memorial General Hospital, watching her daughter's heartbeat flutter on the screen like a tiny bird trying to take flight. She had taken an Uber to the appointment, paying with crumpled bills from her dwindling secret fund. Marcus thought she was at home. He had stopped paying attention to her schedule, confident that she had nowhere to go and no way to get there. He was wrong. The technician stepped out to consult with a doctor about something on the scan. "Nothing to worry about," she assured Sarah, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Just want a second opinion." Sarah sat alone, trying to slow her breathing, when the door burst open. She knew before she even turned around. She knew from the click of expensive heels and the cloud of designer perfume and the cruel laugh that had haunted her nightmares for months. Crystal and Marcus had found her. The attack that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but it stretched into an eternity of pain and fear and desperate prayer. Crystal's fist connecting with her stomach, Marcus laughing in the doorway, the baby kicking wildly as if trying to escape. And then her father appeared. The next several hours passed in fragments. Sarah remembered being lifted onto a gurney, remembered doctors speaking in urgent tones about fetal distress and emergency monitoring, remembered Crystal being handcuffed, and Marcus's smirk finally faltering as police officers took his statement. But mostly she remembered Frank Miller standing in the corner of her hospital room, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The doctors finally cleared the room around midnight, satisfied that Sarah and the baby were stable. The police had taken their reports. Crystal was in custody. Marcus had been escorted off the premises with a warning that any further contact would result in his arrest. Sarah and her father were alone for the first time in a decade. "You should not have come," Sarah said flatly. Her voice was hoarse from crying, from screaming, from hours of answering the same questions over and over. Frank flinched, but did not leave. "Diana called me," he said. "She has been sending me updates for months." Diana? Sarah felt another betrayal settle into her chest, smaller than the others, but still sharp. She did not have the right to do that, no, Frank agreed. But she did it anyway. Because she was worried about you. Because she knew you did not have anyone else. And whose fault is that? The words came out harder than Sarah intended, carrying 10 years of abandonment behind them. Mom died, and you just disappeared. You left me alone. Frank's face crumpled. He suddenly looked every one of his 62 years, a man carrying grief like a physical weight. "I know," he said. "Your mother was my whole world. When she died, I could not function. I started drinking. I pushed everyone away, including you, especially you, because looking at you reminded me of her." Sarah said nothing. She had heard versions of this explanation before, in rare birthday cards and awkward voicemails. It had never been enough. "I got sober 8 years ago," Frank continued. "Joined a program, started going to meetings, and I tried to find you, but you had changed your name, moved, married Marcus. By the time I tracked you down, you were already in deep, and I did not know how to reach you." "So you just gave up?" "No," his voice cracked. "I watched from a distance. I did not know how bad it was until Diana started calling. I did not know he was hurting you. If I had known earlier, I would have come sooner. I would have done something." Sarah looked at her father, really looked at him, for the first time. The gray hair, the calloused hands, the shame in his eyes that mirrored her own. "You cannot fix this," she said quietly. "You do not have money, or lawyers, or power. Marcus's family has this whole town locked down. There's no one who will help me." Frank pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down heavily. "I cannot buy you a fancy lawyer," he admitted, "but I can teach you how to fight. And I know people who owe me favors. Not important people, working people. But working people show up when it matters." "What are you talking about?" "Tomorrow morning," Frank said, "we go to the hospital's patient advocate. You tell them you are a victim of domestic violence and you need a social worker. It is the law. They have to connect you with resources." Sarah blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because I have been doing my research," Frank said. "Ever since Diana first called, I have been learning everything I can about how to help someone in your situation. And step one is getting you connected to the system that exists to help people like you." Sarah was silent for a long moment. Her whole life, she had been waiting for someone to save her. Her mother, before cancer took her away. Marcus, before he revealed what he really was. A lawyer, a miracle, a winning lottery ticket. But her father was not offering to save her. He was offering to teach her to save herself. It was not much, but it was more than she had yesterday. "Okay," Sarah said finally. "What is step 2? Frank almost smiled. "Step 2 is filing a police report. Tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Even if you think nothing will happen. Because every report creates a record, and records win cases." He reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "Step 3, he said, is the hardest one." "What is step 3? "Believing that you deserve to win." The next 2 weeks felt like emerging from underwater after nearly drowning. Everything was sharper, brighter, more overwhelming than Sarah had remembered. She moved into Frank's apartment above the auto repair shop he had owned for 30 years. It was small, just one bedroom and a pull-out couch, filled with the smell of motor oil and the sound of traffic from the street below. It was the safest place Sarah had been in 4 years. The protective order came through on a Monday. A judge signed the paperwork mandating that Marcus stay at least 500 feet away from Sarah at all times. Crystal remained in custody, her bail denied due to the assault being classified as aggravated battery against a pregnant woman. Diana arrived that afternoon with a grocery bag full of supplies and a cake that read, "Congratulations on the first day of the rest of your life." She set everything on Frank's tiny kitchen counter and pulled Sarah into a hug. "You did it," Diana whispered. "You actually did it. You are free." Sarah hugged her back, tears streaming down her face. She could not quite believe it herself. After years of feeling trapped, of tiptoeing around Marcus's moods, of watching her world shrink smaller and smaller, she was out. Frank stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable with the display of emotion, but clearly pleased. The kitchen was now a disaster of baby supplies and legal documents and more food than his refrigerator had ever held. "We should celebrate," Diana announced. "Real celebration. I am ordering pizza." As they waited for the food to arrive, Frank attempted to assemble a portable crib he had bought from a thrift store. Sarah watched him wrestle with the instructions, turning them upside down and sideways, his face scrunch-out in concentration. "How is a human this small?" he muttered, holding up a tiny onesie someone had donated. "This cannot be right. This looks like doll clothes." Sarah found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. "That is newborn size, Dad." "Newborn?" He looked horrified. "She is going to be newborn for how long? A week? Like 2 months." Frank stared at the onesie as if it had personally offended him. "They stay that small for 2 months? How does anyone survive that?" Diana caught Sarah's eye and grinned. Something about the moment felt normal, safe, like a glimpse of what life could be. The pizza arrived. They ate too much. Diana told embarrassing stories about patients at the hospital. Frank complained about modern cars and their impossible computers. Sarah sat surrounded by people who cared about her, one hand resting on her belly, and allowed herself to hope. Maybe this was going to be okay. Maybe she had actually escaped. The knock on the door came at 9:47 p.m. Sarah's heart seized. Frank held up a hand to keep her seated and walked to the door, checking the peephole before opening it. A man in a suit stood outside, holding a manila envelope. "Sarah Miller?" he asked, looking past Frank into the apartment. Sarah stood slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. "That is me." The man held out the envelope. "You have been served." The door closed behind him before anyone could respond. The apartment fell silent except for the sound of Sarah tearing open the envelope with shaking hands. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. Her legs gave out. Diana caught her before she hit the floor. "What is it? What does it say?" Sarah could barely form the words. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Marcus is suing for full custody of the baby." The documents accused Sarah of mental instability, citing a letter from a therapist Sarah had never met. They claimed she had abandoned the marital home without cause. They listed debts she had never known existed, debts in her name only, painting a picture of financial irresponsibility. And there, on the final page, was a paragraph about Frank Miller, recovering alcoholic, unfit to be around children. "He is going to take my baby," Sarah said, the words barely audible. "He is actually going to take my baby." Frank took the documents from her trembling hands and read through them quickly. His jaw tightened with each page. "This is lies," he said. "All of it. Manufactured evidence and paid experts." "It does not matter if it is lies," Sarah's voice cracked. "His family has money. They have lawyers. They have this whole town in their pocket. And I have nothing." Diana knelt beside her, gripping both of Sarah's hands. "You have us. You have the truth. And you have evidence he does not know about." "He found my email," Sarah said. "The documentation I collected. He must have. Or he would not know to file this preemptively." Frank set down the papers, his expression shifting from anger to something more calculated. "Then we find new evidence. We build a new case. And we do it smarter this time." "How?" Sarah looked up at her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Every lawyer in this county is connected to his family. I cannot afford anyone outside the county. I am 8 months pregnant and unemployed and living above a garage." Frank crouched down to her level, meeting her eyes directly. "Then you represent yourself," he said quietly. "What? Pro-C representation. That means you represent yourself. I looked it up. Judges do not like it, but they have to allow it. And Sarah?" He gripped her shoulders gently. "You spent 3 years working as a paralegal. You know more about family court than half the attorneys in this town." Sarah stared at him. The idea seemed impossible. Insane. She could not argue against Marcus's expensive lawyers by herself, but she also could not afford not to. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. What do I do first?" Frank almost smiled. "First, we learn the rules. Then we use them against him." The law library at the county courthouse was quiet at 2 in the morning. Sarah sat alone at a table, covered in legal textbooks, her laptop open to a dozen browser tabs, a legal pad full of handwritten notes beside her. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night since Marcus filed his custody suit. Every spare moment went into research, preparation, building the case that would determine whether she kept her daughter. "If you are representing yourself," she murmured to herself, practicing the speech she would give to the judge, "you need to show preparation. Type everything. Bring 3 copies. Speak slowly. Say your honor frequently. And when you do not know something, say, 'I am not an attorney, but I understand.' Humility works. Judges remember humility." She wrote it down in her notebook, the same notebook where she had once hidden her escape money. The $847 was gone now, spent on filing fees and certified mail and supplies for the baby who would arrive in just a few weeks. But the notebook was still useful. It held everything she knew about surviving what was coming. The first catastrophe struck 3 days before her initial court hearing. Sarah was reviewing her evidence folder, organizing the documentation she had spent months collecting. The recordings, the photographs, the emails she had sent herself from an address Marcus did not know about, except he did know about it. The letter from Marcus's lawyer arrived that morning. It informed her that all documentation she had collected during the marriage had been obtained through illegal surveillance of a spouse seeking separation, and that any attempt to introduce it as evidence would be met with a motion to strike and a countersuit for invasion of privacy. Attached to the letter were copies of her own emails, transcripts of her voice recordings, screenshots of messages she had thought were private. "How?" Sarah whispered, leafing through the pages. "How did he get all of this?" Diana's face went pale. Oh God. Oh God, Sarah, I think this is my fault. What do you mean? When I helped you set up that email account, I used the computer at my station. The hospital computer. Diana pressed her hands to her face. Marcus must have someone at the hospital, someone who accessed the login records. The room tilted. Months of careful work destroyed. But before Sarah could process this loss, the second catastrophe hit. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged her in a video on social media. It was Crystal. Crystal Vance, out on bail despite the assault charges, had posted a video that was rapidly going viral. In it, she sat in a tastefully decorated living room, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, speaking directly into the camera. "I am the real victim here," Crystal said. "This poor pregnant woman, act, is exactly that, an act. Sarah Miller attacked me first. I was defending myself. She has been stalking Marcus for months, using her pregnancy as a weapon to destroy his life." She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Believe women? How about believe this woman? I have evidence. I have witnesses. And when the truth comes out, everyone is going to see Sarah Miller for what she really is." The video had 2 million views and climbing. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Crystal. Sarah's name was being shared, her photos were being posted, strangers were sending her messages calling her a manipulative liar. Sarah turned off her phone and threw it across the room, but the worst was still coming. The third catastrophe happened in the courtroom itself. Sarah arrived at the temporary custody hearing with her typed documents, her 3 copies, her carefully rehearsed statements. Frank sat in the gallery behind her, along with several of his mechanic friends who had shown up to offer moral support. Marcus's side of the courtroom was filled with lawyers in expensive suits and family members with practiced expressions of concern. The hearing began. Sarah made her opening statement, hitting every point she had practiced. The judge seemed attentive, even sympathetic. And then Marcus's lawyer called his star witness. Sarah's heart stopped when Diana Cole walked to the witness stand. Diana would not look at her. She kept her eyes forward, her hands clasped in her lap, her face a mask of rehearsed emotion. "Ms. Cole," Marcus's lawyer began, "can you describe your relationship with Sarah Miller?" Diana's voice was flat. "We became friends during her prenatal care. She confided in me about her marriage." "And what did she confide?" Diana swallowed hard. "She told me she was planning to fabricate abuse claims against Marcus. She asked me to help her hide assets. She said she would do whatever it took to make sure Marcus never saw his child again." The courtroom erupted. Sarah sat frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. The woman she had trusted, the woman who had brought her cake and called her father and helped her plan her escape. Diana was lying. Or was she? "Miss Cole," the lawyer continued, "are you aware that Mrs. Miller's father is a recovering alcoholic?" "Yes?" Diana's voice cracked slightly. "She told me she was concerned about raising a baby around him. She said she wished there was another option." Sarah finally found her voice. "That is a lie, Diana. Why are you doing this?" The judge banged her gavel. "Mrs. Miller, you will have your opportunity to respond. Please remain silent." But Sarah could barely hear her. The room was spinning. Everything she had built was crumbling after Diana stepped down, after the lawyers finished their arguments, after the longest 3 hours of Sarah's life. The judge made her ruling. "Based on the testimony presented, I am granting temporary custody to Mr. Miller pending a full psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Miller and a home study of her current living situation." The gavel fell. Marcus smiled. Sarah collapsed into Frank's arms as the courtroom emptied, sobbing so hard she could not catch her breath. She had done everything right. She had documented and prepared and learned the law. She had found people to help her and believed in the system, and she had still lost. Everyone I trusted, she gasped between sobs. Everyone. How do I fight people who have everything when I have nothing? Frank held her tighter, his own voice rough with emotion. You have something they will never have, he said. The truth, and the truth is patient. It waits, it finds its way out. But in that moment, with her baby kicking frantically inside her and her future slipping away, Sarah did not know how to believe him. The apartment above the garage had never felt smaller than it did in the weeks following the custody hearing. Sarah spent the first 3 days in bed, unable to eat, barely able to move, watching her phone fill up with hateful messages from strangers who believed Crystal's viral video. On the 4th day, Frank brought her a cup of coffee and sat on the edge of her bed. You have 2 choices, he said quietly. You can stay down, accept that they beat you. Let them take everything. Sarah said nothing. Or, Frank continued, you can get up, learn from what happened, and fight smarter. How? Her voice was a croak. Diana betrayed me. My evidence is gone. The whole town thinks I am crazy. Frank set down the coffee. Did you know that when I was in recovery, I had to start over 7 times? 7 times I thought I was done, and 7 times I had to pick myself back up. That is different. Is it? He leaned forward. The first time I got sober, I did it wrong. I white-knuckled it alone, and I failed. The second time, I tried it my way again, failed again. It took me until the 4th attempt to realize that I needed to change my approach, not just my effort. Sarah finally looked at him. You have been fighting this battle the way they expect you to fight it, Frank said. You documented in secret, so they invaded your privacy. You found a friend, so they turned her against you. You tried to use the system, so they used their money to break the system. So what am I supposed to do differently? Frank's expression hardened. Stop hiding. Start making noise. Make this fight so public that they cannot bury you in the dark. For a moment, Sarah just stared at him. Then, slowly, something shifted behind her eyes. She sat up. Public, she repeated. You mean like Crystal's video? Exactly like Crystal's video, except with something she does not have. What is that? The truth, and receipts to prove it. That night, Sarah returned to the law library. But this time, she was not researching custody law. She was researching Marcus Miller, his business deals, his family's dealership, his financial records, the ones that were technically public information if you knew where to look. And she found something interesting. Marcus Miller was not rich. He was pretending to be rich, and badly. His credit cards were maxed out. His car was leased. The apartment they had shared was 3 months behind on rent. But it got worse. His expense reports at work, the ones he filed to the company he managed PR for, did not match his actual spending. Thousands of dollars discrepancies. Hotel rooms that had nothing to do with client meetings. Jewelry purchases that never appeared on company inventory. Marcus was embezzling. Sarah spent the next week building a new case, not just a custody case, a criminal case. She subpoenaed Diana's phone records. If Diana had been coordinating with Marcus, there would be a trail. She contacted the accounting department at Marcus's company, filing a public records request for his expense reports. She found witnesses, not fancy witnesses with credentials and titles, regular people. The mailman who had seen Marcus scream at her in the driveway, the grocery store clerk who had watched him grab her arm hard enough to leave marks, the elderly neighbor who had heard crying through their shared wall night after night. And she found one more person. Crystal Vance had a roommate, a woman named Brittany who had watched Crystal spiral deeper into Marcus's manipulation over the past year, a woman who had saved text messages where Crystal admitted that Marcus had told her exactly what to say in her viral video. Sarah met Brittany at a coffee shop 2 towns over, where no one would recognize either of them. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked. "You are Crystal's friend." Brittany stirred her coffee slowly. "I was Crystal's friend. Before Marcus, she used to be funny and kind and real. Now she is just," Brittany shrugged sadly, "a puppet. He tells her what to think, and she thinks it." She slid a folder across the table. "I saved everything. Text messages, voicemails, even a video where he coaches her on what to say about you. I do not know if it will help, but I could not live with myself if I did not try." Sarah opened the folder. Inside was everything she needed. "Why did you save all this?" she asked. "Because I knew," Brittany said quietly. "Someday, someone was going to need proof. I just did not know it would be you." 2 weeks before her full custody trial, Sarah presented her evidence to the district attorney's office. Not the local DA, who was friendly with the Miller family, but the state DA's office, 3 counties over. She brought the expense reports, the phone records, Brittany's folder, her own documentation, reframed not as surveillance but as evidence of financial fraud affecting multiple parties. The state DA opened an investigation into Marcus Miller for embezzlement and fraud. And suddenly the man who thought he was untouchable had something bigger to worry about than custody. The courtroom felt different the second time, smaller somehow, more human, less like a temple of judgment, and more like just a room where decisions got made. Sarah sat at the respondents' table, alone. No lawyer, no legal team, just a woman in a borrowed maternity dress, 9 months pregnant, armed with nothing but the truth and the receipts to prove it. Frank sat in the first row of the gallery with his mechanic friends. Big Tony, the massive biker with neck tattoos, who had spent every night for 2 weeks quizzing Sarah on legal terminology. Miguel, who had notarized her documents for free at his real estate office. Doreen, Frank's bookkeeper, who had helped Sarah trace Marcus's fraudulent expense reports. They did not look like a legal team. They looked like the support system of a woman who had nothing else. Marcus's side of the courtroom was noticeably emptier than before. His lawyers were present, but the family members who had crowded the gallery last time were conspicuously absent. Word of the state investigation had spread. Judge Patterson entered, and everyone rose. "Mrs. Miller," the judge said, looking at Sarah directly, "I understand you are representing yourself today." "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah's voice was steady, the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "Very well. You may proceed with your opening statement." Sarah stood. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "Your Honor, I am not an attorney. I am a paralegal, a mother, and a woman who has spent the last 4 years being systematically controlled by the man sitting across from me." She picked up a folder from her table. "During our last hearing, Mr. Miller's legal team presented testimony from Diana Cole, who claimed I had fabricated abuse and planned to alienate my child from her father. I would like to submit into evidence phone records obtained through legal subpoena showing over 200 text messages between Ms. Cole and Mr. Miller in the month before her testimony." She handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and opposing counsel. "These messages reveal that Mr. Miller threatened Ms. Cole's 7-year-old son if she did not testify according to his instructions. I have also submitted an affidavit from Ms. Cole, who has come forward voluntarily to recant her previous testimony and describe the coercion she experienced." Marcus's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not disclosed in discovery. It was obtained after discovery closed, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. "Through legal channels. I have provided the chain of custody documentation." Judge Patterson examined the papers, her expression unreadable. "I will allow it. Continue." Sarah continued. She presented the expense report showing Marcus had embezzled over $78,000 from his employer. She called the grocery store clerk, who described watching Marcus grab Sarah's arm hard enough to leave bruises. She showed Crystal's own social media posts bragging about trips and jewelry and luxury items, then showed Marcus's financial records proving he could not afford any of it. And then she presented Brittany's folder. The video of Marcus coaching Crystal on her viral testimony played on the courtroom monitor. His voice was unmistakable, telling Crystal exactly which lies to tell and how to tell them. When it ended, the courtroom was silent. Judge Patterson looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Mr. Miller, I have been a family court judge for 23 years. In that time, I have seen many cases where parents behave badly during divorce proceedings, but I have rarely seen such a comprehensive pattern of manipulation, fraud, and abuse of the legal system as what has been presented here today." Marcus's lawyer tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, we request a continuance to respond to this new evidence." "Denied," Patterson said flatly. "You have had ample opportunity to present your case honestly. Instead, you chose to suborn perjury and manufacture evidence. I am not inclined to give you more time to create additional fabrications." She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Miller, I am reversing the temporary custody order effective immediately. You will retain full custody of your child upon birth. Mr. Miller's visitation will be supervised and limited to every other weekend." Sarah could not breathe. She gripped the edge of the table, afraid her knees would give out. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of perjury, witness tampering, and fraud. Mr. Miller, I strongly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel." The gavel fell. Sarah turned to look at Frank. His eyes were wet. Big Tony was openly crying, dabbing at his face with a bandana. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people processed what had just happened. It was over. She had won. That night, Frank made dinner in his tiny kitchen while Sarah sat on the couch, exhausted and elated and still not quite believing any of it was real. Her phone buzzed with messages of congratulations from people she barely knew, people who had followed her story, people who had been rooting for her without her knowledge. For the first time in years, the future felt possible. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She almost did not answer, but something made her press the green button. "Ms. Miller," a voice said, "this is Detective Morrison with the County Sheriff's Office. I need you to come to the station immediately." Sarah's heart seized. What is wrong? Did something happen? There was a long pause on the other end. "Marcus Miller was just arrested," the detective said. Sarah exhaled. "Finally, for the embezzlement?" "No, ma'am," Morrison replied, and his voice was strange. "For the murder of Crystal Vance." The world tilted sideways, and Mrs. Miller, the detective continued, "He is saying you did it." The police station was cold and bright and smelled like industrial cleaner. Sarah sat in a plastic chair, hands folded in her lap, trying to control her breathing, while her mind raced through every possible scenario. Crystal was dead. Marcus claimed Sarah killed her. And somehow, impossibly, there was evidence. Detective Morrison sat across from her, a folder open on the table between them. His expression was professionally neutral, but Sarah had spent enough years reading faces to see the doubt in his eyes. "Ms. Miller," he said, "can you account for your whereabouts yesterday between 2 and 6 p.m.? "I was at the courthouse," Sarah said. "You can check the records. The hearing lasted until almost 4, and then I was with my father and his friends until well after 7. Morrison nodded slowly. "That matches what we have. The problem is, there is a window of about 45 minutes between when you left the courthouse and when witnesses place you at the restaurant with your father." "45 minutes?" Sarah repeated. "That is how long it takes to get from the courthouse to the restaurant with traffic." Morrison pulled a photograph from the folder and slid it across the table. "Miss Miller, can you explain why a knife with your fingerprints was found at the crime scene?" Sarah looked at the photograph. A kitchen knife, wooden handle, distinctive pattern on the blade. She recognized it immediately. "That is from my old apartment," she said. "From when I lived with Marcus. I have not touched that knife in months." "Then how did it end up in Crystal Vance's living room with your prints on it?" Sarah's hands started shaking. "He kept it. He must have kept it specifically for this." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "I have to be honest with you, Ms. Miller. We also found text messages on Crystal's phone. Threats from your number, screenshots of you telling her you would make her pay." "I never sent those messages," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Marcus has been monitoring my phone. He installed spyware months ago. He could have sent those from my number." Morrison studied her for a long moment. "Do you have any proof of that?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. All her evidence had been discredited. Her documentation had been reframed as illegal surveillance. Her credibility had been systematically destroyed. She started, then stopped. The door opened. A uniformed officer stuck his head in. "Detective." "We have a situation." Morrison stood. "Stay here, Ms. Miller." He left, and Sarah was alone. She sat in that plastic chair, 9 months pregnant, accused of murder, more alone than she had ever been in her life. Outside the window, she could see the parking lot, where police cars sat in orderly rows. Somewhere in this building, Marcus Miller was giving his statement, spinning whatever story would bury her the deepest. This was his final move: kill Crystal to silence her, frame Sarah to destroy her. With Sarah in prison for murder, he would get the baby. He would get everything. Sarah closed her eyes and pressed her hands against her stomach. "I am so sorry, baby girl," she whispered. "I tried so hard, I fought so hard." She thought about Frank, who had finally come back into her life only to watch her lose everything. About Big Tony and Miguel and Doreen, who had rallied around a woman they barely knew because they believed in her. About Diana, who had betrayed her. And Brittany, who had tried to save her, and all the people in between who had chosen sides in a war Sarah never wanted to fight. And she thought about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 22, who had always said that the truth would protect you if you held on to it tight enough. "I am still holding, Mom," Sarah whispered, "but I do not know if it is enough anymore." The door opened again. Morrison walked back in, but his expression had changed. He looked uncertain now, almost confused. "Ms. Miller," he said, "there is someone here to see you." A woman walked in behind him, Diana Cole. Sarah's heart lurched. The woman who had betrayed her. The woman whose lies had nearly cost her everything. But Diana did not look like an enemy. She looked terrified, exhausted, and determined. "Tell her," Morrison said to Diana. "Tell her what you told me." Diana met Sarah's eyes. "For the first time since the courtroom. I have been working with Marcus for months," she said, her voice shaking. "But not the way you think. He threatened my son. He said if I did not cooperate, he would hurt Jaden." Sarah stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I had to make him believe I was on his side." Diana stepped closer. "So I did everything he asked. I testified against you. I gave him information. I let him think I was his puppet." She pulled a phone from her pocket. "But the whole time, I was recording him. Every conversation, every threat, every plan." Morrison took the phone. Ms. Cole provided us with audio recordings of Marcus Miller confessing to planning Crystal's murder. He describes in detail how he intended to frame you for it. Sarah felt the room tilt. "He confessed?" "On tape," Morrison confirmed. 3 weeks ago, before Crystal was even dead." Sarah looked at Diana. Tears were streaming down both their faces. "Why?" Sarah whispered. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because I knew you would try to stop me. Diana said. Or you would give it away somehow. He had to believe I was really on his side, and I could not risk Jaden. She crossed the room and took Sarah's hands. I am so sorry for what I put you through. I will never forgive myself for those weeks when you thought you were alone. But you were never alone, Sarah. I was fighting for you the whole time. I just had to do it in the dark. The door opened one more time, and Crystal Vance walked in. Sarah's heart stopped. The woman was supposed to be dead. She had seen the photographs. She had been accused of murdering her, but here she was, alive, pale, and terrified. Crystal met Sarah's eyes, and for the first time, there was no venom there, just exhaustion and shame. He was poisoning me, Crystal said quietly. Antifreeze in my smoothies. I found out a month ago. Diana helped me fake my death so I could escape. Morrison nodded. Ms. Vance has been in protective custody for the past 72 hours. The crime scene was staged to draw out Mr. Miller's confession. Sarah could not process what she was hearing. It was too much, too fast, the entire nightmare turning inside out. There is one more thing, Morrison said. He pulled another folder from the stack. During our investigation of Mr. Miller's finances, we discovered that the Miller family dealership has been bankrupt for 2 years. His parents cut him off financially when they learned about his embezzlement. Everything he owns, the car, the apartment, the lifestyle he showed off, is based on credit card fraud and stolen money. He set the folder on the table. Marcus Miller is not a powerful man, Mrs. Miller. He is a pathetic con artist who destroyed 3 women's lives to maintain an illusion that never existed. Sarah looked down at the folder, then at Diana, then at Crystal. 3 women, all manipulated by the same man, all pitted against each other by someone who saw them only as tools, but in the end, they had saved each other. The criminal trial of Marcus Miller lasted 4 days. Sarah sat in the gallery, not as a defendant, but as a witness. Diana sat beside her, and Crystal sat on Diana's other side. 3 women who should have been enemies, united by the man who had tried to destroy them all. Frank was there too, with Big Tony and Miguel and half the staff of the auto shop. Brittany sat in the back row, watching the man who had twisted her friend into something unrecognizable. The prosecution presented everything. The audio recordings of Marcus confessing to planning Crystal's murder, the evidence of embezzlement totaling over $200,000 across 3 years, the Ponzi scheme that had defrauded 47 investors, the spyware he had installed on Sarah's phone, the threats he had made against Diana's son. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with steady legs. Her daughter was due in 2 weeks. Her body was exhausted, but her voice was clear. The prosecutor led her through the story, the manipulation, the financial control, the isolation, the attack in the hospital. And then he asked the question Sarah had been waiting for. Mrs. Miller, what do you want the court to understand about your experience? Sarah looked at Marcus. He sat at the defense table, smaller somehow than she remembered. His expensive suit hung loose. His eyes were empty. Then she looked at the jury. Regular people, working people, people who probably knew someone like her, or someone like Marcus, or someone who had been caught between the two. I want them to understand that I am not special, Sarah said. I am not stronger than other women. I am not smarter. I made every mistake you can make. I stayed too long. I believed too many lies. I trusted the wrong people. She paused, gathering herself. But I also did something right. I documented. I prepared. I found people who believed me, not because they were rich or powerful, but because they were kind. A nurse, a mechanic, a biker named Tony who quizzed me on legal terms in his garage. Big Tony wiped his eyes in the gallery. Marcus counted on me being alone. He counted on me being silent. He counted on the system being on his side. And for a long time, he was right. She looked directly at Marcus now. But here's what I learned. The truth is patient. It does not need money or power or connections. It just needs someone willing to hold on to it long enough for it to matter. She turned back to the jury. I held on, not because I am brave, but because I had to. Because my daughter needed me to keep fighting even when everything said to stop. Her voice broke, but she kept going. If you are watching this case, and you are in your own trap, I am not going to tell you it will be easy. It will not. I am not going to tell you justice always wins. It does not. But I am going to tell you this. The version of yourself that survives, she is coming. She is closer than you think. And she is going to be so proud of the woman who kept fighting. The courtroom was silent. Then a woman in the jury box started crying. Then another. Then the man beside her, who looked like he had not cried in years. The judge called for a recess. The verdict came down the next afternoon. Guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree, embezzlement, fraud, witness tampering, criminal conspiracy. Marcus Miller was sentenced to 35 years to life. He would be in his 70s before he was eligible for parole. Crystal was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. She entered a rehabilitation program and eventually reconciled with her family. Diana returned to her nursing job, though she transferred to a different hospital. She and Sarah remained close, bound by something deeper than ordinary friendship. And Sarah's daughter, was born 2 weeks later in the same hospital where everything had started. Frank was in the waiting room, pacing like a man half his age. Big Tony had brought flowers that were way too big for the room. Diana held Sarah's hand through the final hours of labor. She named her daughter Hope. Not because the world had given her reasons for hope, but because she had made her own. 6 months later, Sarah sat on a park bench with Hope sleeping in a carrier beside her. The trees were starting to turn gold and red. Children played on the swing set while their parents watched from nearby. A young woman approached hesitantly. She was probably 25, wearing a hoodie and jeans, her eyes red from crying. "I am sorry to bother you," she said. "I saw your story on the news. I am in a situation, and I do not know what to do." Sarah looked at her. She recognized that expression, that particular mixture of shame and fear and desperate hope. She had worn it herself not so long ago. She shifted Hope's carrier and patted the bench beside her. "Sit down," Sarah said. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." "I have time," the young woman sat. She started talking. Sarah listened. Behind them, Frank arrived with coffee, saw what was happening, and quietly took Hope's carrier to give them privacy. "Your mama is collecting strays again," he murmured to the sleeping baby. "That is okay. That is why we love her." Sarah talked to the young woman for over an hour. She gave her phone numbers for shelters and legal aid and crisis lines. She wrote down the name of a lawyer 3 counties over who did payment plans. She explained how to document, how to plan, how to build an escape route piece by piece. And she told her the most important thing. "You are not crazy," Sarah said. "You are not making this up. And you are not alone. Even when it feels like you are, I promise you, there are people who will believe you." The young woman nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not think anyone would understand." Sarah squeezed her hand. "I understand. And when you get out, you are going to find other women who understand too. That is how it works. We survive and then we help each other survive." The young woman left eventually, clutching the paper with phone numbers like a lifeline. Sarah watched her go, then turned back to Frank and Hope. "Ready to head home?" Frank asked. Sarah looked at her daughter, at her father, at the park full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. A year ago, she would have given anything to be one of them. Now she understood that ordinary was just a story people told themselves and that underneath, everyone was fighting something. Yeah, she said, let us go home. They walked together toward the parking lot. Frank carried the diaper bag. Hope slept peacefully. The autumn sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path, and Sarah Miller, survivor, mother, fighter, walked into her future with her head held high. She had been broken. She had been rebuilt. She had learned that the truth was patient, that help came from unexpected places, and that the woman who survives is always worth fighting for. If you are in your own trap right now, listening to this story in the dark, let me tell you what I wish someone had told me. Document everything, even when it seems pointless, even when you are sure no one will believe you. Find one person you can trust, just one. That is enough to start, and never ever stop believing that you deserve to be free. The version of you that survives, she is coming. She is closer than you think. Hold on for her, she is worth it. You are worth it. If this story touches your heart, do me one small favor. Hit that like button. Not for me, but for every woman still fighting her own battle in silence. Your like helps this story reach her. Drop a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me who this story reminded you of. Or simply write the words, I survived, if you have your own story of overcoming. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know whose life you might change with a single click. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because stories like Sarah's deserve to be told, and you deserve to hear them. Final statement. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and valuable life lessons to our audience. Every word was chosen with purpose. Every scene was crafted to inspire, to educate, and to remind you that no matter how dark your situation may seem, there is always a path forward. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that stories have the power to change lives. Now, let us begin.